Welcome back, ladies and gents, to Storytime with Zell. Sit back, relax, grab a bowl of your favorite popcorn, and listen as I spin you a tale. Chapters 5 and 6 of Eternal Care Forest. Chapter 5. The Pit. Flooding your lungs with water is a painful way to go. But when the alternative is certain death, you swim as hard as you can. Taking in a big breath of water seemed like a nice relaxing time at the beach once James pulled Will out of the water and onto the shore. Then doing mouth-to-mouth CPR to get the water out of Will's lungs, and coughing out water himself as he sits back on the rocky shore, looking around them. The cavern room was like a dome, and huge, 20 or 30 feet high, and at least 60 or 70 feet wide, with half a dozen tunnels leading off in several different directions, and a wide, underground lake that James and Will definitely won't be diving into again anytime soon. James reaches over to grab Will's shoulders as he says, "You okay, man? I know you're in pain, but he's gonna be after us soon. It's like it's all just a fucking game to him. But we gotta stay 3 steps ahead. You with me, William?" Will could barely breathe, coughing and sputtering out water before nodding, wincing in pain and pressing his hand to his split ear. The water from the tunnel having washed away the blood from their cuts, but leaving a stinging pain. James says, "Just be thankful it wasn't salt water, Will." Then grimaces, pressing his hand against a deep cut on his chest. Breathing deep, then pointing to a tunnel with large, luminescent crystals bordering it, as he says, "Okay, we don't have time to sit around thinking, so we'll just have to go for it." Will stands up and says, "Alright. Look for big rocks or something, though. Something to defend ourselves with." James nodding as they start limping through the tunnels as quick as they can. "Right. God damn it, why'd you leave the shotgun back in the car?" The tunnel was strange. Not just for the glowing crystals lining the sides, but occasionally there were lit candles beside the crystals, lighting up the paths in certain tunnels up ahead, almost as if guiding them. Will looks to a few of the candles and says, "That big guy was blind. He wouldn't need the candles." "What put these here? And why?" James looks over to Will, shaking his head as he says, "I don't know, man. But I do know we're gonna get out of this mess, no matter what this twisted sideshow throws at us." Then looks down and picks up a large rock, about the size of his fist, as he adds, "This'll do. Anything comes after us, bam!" Will nodding, but still unsure about what was ahead, looking over his shoulder behind them. In the darkness of the large room where they came from, it looked like something was watching them. Reaching out and grabbing James's arm, Will points behind them at the dark red circles that look like eyes in the darkness, and asks shakily, "What is that?" James squints his eyes, trying to see before saying, "Probably just a couple of the red glowy stones we saw. Come on, let's keep going." Will kept watching for a few seconds before looking ahead again and following James. Eventually, they come to an opening, and a very strange one at that. Smaller than the first chamber, this one was maybe 12 feet high and about 20 wide, with 2 other tunnels on either side of the room. The odd part being the distinctly Japanese stone archway. And just past it in the middle of the chamber was a large well, with several heavy white ropes wrapped around it. Will held James back with his arm as he says, "Hold up, man. I recognize this sort of thing. From what I've read, it's a Torii gate. Supposed to be the doorway between our world and the spirit world." James brushes aside Will's hand, irritated as he responds with, "Oh yeah? Since when did you become so damn superstitious? There ain't no such thing as spirits or a spirit world. Just a bunch of crazy nonsense. And if you forgot, there's a real-life monster that tortured us and is still coming after us." Will tries to stop him, but James pushes Will aside and walks under the gate, looking at the well and peering inside curiously. Then shakes his head and says, "Can't see the bottom." Will slowly walks through the gate too, saying, "That's 'cause it's a prison for something." James snapping back with, "Shut up, dumbass." But Will continues with, "No, dude, that's what the ropes are for. They're used like that to contain spirits." And James scoffs at him. "Well, now I know you're full of it. Lids are used to contain stuff, moron." But both of them wince as they hear a distorted, growling sound coming from the well. James shivering up his spine as he stammers a bit, There was nothing there," and slowly leans over the edge of it to look inside, saying softly, "What was..." but gets suddenly interrupted and screams when a large, clawed hand, with familiar red scales all over it, reaches up from the black darkness of the well to grab James by his face, trying to pull him down into the pit. Will screams in terror before grabbing James's chest and pulling, fighting against the demon's arm, which shakes James and Will both back and forth as if they weighed nothing, digging its claws into James's face and making him bleed profusely down his face and chest onto Will's hands. James still screaming in agony and terror, but pressing one hand against the edge of the well, and the other grabbing the demon's hand, trying to pry it from his face. Then suddenly a sharp cracking sound is heard, and a thin jet stream of water hits the wall with so much force that it actually cracks part of the stone, followed immediately by a guttural scream from inside the well, as the demon's arm tilts back and falls off the arm at the elbow joint, sinking back down into the darkness of the well, while James and Will both fall onto their backs. Behind them stood a figure clad in heavy black leather, with a distinct black hat and a white bird mask with red circular lenses that glistened in the light, perfectly resembling a plague doctor, complete with a medical rod with a bird-like ornamental head he leaned against. Aside from a few details, such as the long, dark, indigo-scaled tail that swayed in a motion like an infinity loop behind it, with a red, slowly spinning ring with 4 spikes on its tail. And its feet are like that of a raptor's, with deep, dark blue scales along the back and the sides of its feet, and nearly black indigo scales going up the front of the feet and up along the doctor's shins, and 2 black, long, notched horns arching back through its hat, all the while staring at James and Will. They start getting to their feet, and James starts to say, "Look, we don't want any more before getting bashed in the side of the head by the medical rod, falling to the ground unconscious. Will puts his hands up well on his knees, saying, "Oh, please, please, we didn't mean any disrespect." The plague doctor grabs Will by the chest and lifts him up, saying, "If that were true, you wouldn't even be here." Before Will's vision starts to distort and slowly tilt a bit as he sees the plague doctor's mask rip open along the mouth as if it were some monster bird from his worst nightmares. Teeth everywhere and blood pouring from its mouth and eyes as it lunges at Will's face, ripping it off and eating it with him still watching, making him scream again and again until he passes out. Chapter 6. Children of Death. James awoke startled, taking in a sudden deep gasp. Yet again he couldn't move. In the lab room from before, strapped down to a medical table, only this time a little girl was leaning over him from behind. 10 or 11 years old from the look of her. Deathly pale, just like Xelion, only with dyed, dark red hair, black at the roots and eyebrows, and big, vibrantly red eyes. Wearing a red tank top and black shorts, looking intently over every inch of James's face, then eventually says, "I like your eyes," and smiles, an oddly disturbing smile with how wide her staring eyes were. James takes a few seconds to breathe and focus his blurry vision, then says, Hi, little girl. You, want to help me get out of here?" She nods excitedly and walks around the table to James's side. And it was then that he realized she had 3 small horns, less than an inch long, growing out of her head, 2 at the corners of her forehead and 1 in the center, and black scales along her forehead, shoulders, and forearms. And instead of helping him, she holds high an immi-piercer, about the size of a ruler and extremely sharp, and starts to plunge it down toward James's chest, only to be stopped by the plague doctor from before, who says, Now, Jet, Daddy said alive." Then a boy, Jet's twin brother from the look of it, but wearing a white muscle shirt with a dark blue hakama, with all black hair and only 2 horns, curling in opposite directions, even though they are the same size as Jet's, growing out of the corners of his forehead, and white scales in the same spots as Jet's black scales, says, "But it's so fun," at the same time that Jet says the exact same thing. The doctor shakes his head, but the twins continue their way of talking, often speaking at once or finishing the other sentence. Jet starting with, "Careful cuts, then. Just enough," with the twin brother finishing, "to get our hands in." James looking back and forth in horror at the children, then gasping as the doctor nods and says, "Oh, all right, Gemini. Just make sure your sister doesn't kill him." To which the little boy Gemini, or was it Jet that was the boy, and Gem that was the girl? But he nods enthusiastically, James starting to protest, before crying out in pain as Jet slides the piercer long ways along James's thigh, deep enough to split muscle and spill blood all over the table. Then Jet sets aside her piercer, and giggles before thrusting her small hands and curious fingers inside James's leg, lighting his mind on fire with pain, screaming and squirming as much as he can against the restraints as she gets her hands soaked in his blood, pressing against his veins and nerves in the process, each movement sending unbearable pain shooting throughout him. After what felt like forever, even though it was only 5 seconds later, Jet takes her hands out of James's leg and runs her fingers through her hair, using it like hair dye to make her hair stay red with James's blood. Then the familiar blue glow returns as Xelion comes downstairs to the lab, having heard everything. His metal hand back to normal as he affectionately wraps his arms around the doctor and nuzzles his horns lovingly, before standing beside Jet, grabbing James's leg with his normal hand and using the claws of his metal hand, which had a tiny hole in the thumb claw, to run a thread through, and uses his mechanical fingers like a rapid-moving sewing kit, stitching up James's wound quickly while saying, You took a wrong turn, James. In many parts of your life, but especially in the caves. That shrine you found is our charge. We protect the rest of the world from the creatures that crawl out of it. That's why our forest is off limits to your kind, which, of course, you ignored, and now you are here. There you go, good as new, and pats James's freshly sewn-up wound, making him scream in pain. Xelion giggles similar to how Jet did earlier, or was it Gemini? Then says, "You thought I was gonna chase after you in the caves?" I took a nap. Hunting is tiring, but I'm glad you met my dear sweet soulmate Jeremiah, and motions to the doctor with his metal hand. Jeremiah tapping his hat with his cane, then walking over to the second medical bed with Will on it, and slaps his face hard, waking Will up, who starts screaming, "My face!" before being muffled by Jer's hand, who says, "Be quiet, you silly man. You still have your face. Last night was just a powerful hallucination. It was all in here," and taps Will's forehead. William looks to the Graves family, from Xelion to Jet and Gemini, then to Jeremiah, then says, "So, the 4 of you guard that pit of hell?" To which Xelion giggles and shakes his head. "4 of us? Good gravy, nyet. Sweet potato cupcakes, you don't look around much, do you?" Even Jeremiah has to tilt his head to that string of words coming from Xelion. Then says, "Our kids are far older than you think, and there's a lot more of them. We have quite the family." And smiles happily behind his mask. Then coughs as Zell adds, "Like rabbits!" happily, putting his hands on his hips proudly. James looks to Jeremiah and says, "Well, you and your family can go jump in that pit and die, bitch." And without missing a beat, Zell walks over beside James and shoves his metal hand through James's chest, effortlessly piercing his skin and sliding the metal fingers through muscle to grasp one of his ribs firmly, and breaks it off and pulls it out of James in the same motion, tearing a huge gash in James's chest and lung, leaving his heart and lung visible, along with a few other ribs, getting blood all over him and the table, and making him go into a seizure and asphyxiation from the shock and so much overwhelming pain, and the blood flooding his freshly ripped lung. While Zell points at James with his normal hand and says coldly, "Respect my family, and watch your mouth." Xelion then hands the rib to Jet and Gemini, who share it like a popsicle, handing it back and forth to each other to lick the blood off, while Xelion uses his metal tentacles to hold down James and stop him from shaking, as Zell stitches up the new wounds in his veins, arteries, lung, and chest in only a matter of seconds. James, however, lies still after a few more seconds, eyes open and not breathing. Will starts to cry. You killed him!" But before Will can protest further, Xelion places his normal hand on James's chest, over the stitches, and Xelion's tentacles and horns start dissolving away from metal and revealing flowing electricity, the same color as his blue glowing scars. Still retaining the shapes of his tentacles and horns, then he sends a powerful jolt of electricity through James's body, who arches his back hard and takes in a deep gasp of air as the blood flooding his lungs superheats incredibly fast, and he starts coughing out ashes, his eyes darting around, trying to understand as he stammers, What hap? And Zell pats James's cheek with his blood-covered metal hand. "Hi, welcome back." William blinks hard, trying to understand as well, then asks shakily, What What are you? Xelion walks backward to stand between James and Will, so they can both see him clearly as Zell takes off his mask, his interlocking sharp teeth and lower jaws tilting upward in a massive and literal ear-to-ear grin. The glowing scars shifting the direction of their glow from Will to James and back, as if there was a light within Zell looking out, sensing them almost in the same manner as eyes would. Only for him it processes like sound. Watching them with his scar lights, as Jeremiah walks over to stand beside Xelion with his arm wrapped around Zell's hips. Then Jet and Gemini stand beside their parents, holding Jer and Zell's hands, though Jet lifts Zell's metal hand to her mouth to lick the blood off, as Xelion says, "I am the Lord of Nightmares. I am living lightning. Life in one hand, death in the other. We are the immortal guardians of Eternal Care Forest. And as long as your lives last, you will stay with us. And like I say, I don't kill." James and Will were terrified to the breaking point of sanity. Then Jet tugs on Xelion's hand, and Gemini says, "We like their eyes." And Zell looks down at his kids and nods. Jet and Gemini clapping their hands together and skipping over to the medical table, Jet picking up her Emmy piercer and tossing Gemini her second one. James and Will both start shaking against their bindings, strongly protesting the idea as they both say, "No, no, 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 no! Not the eyes, no!" Xelion wraps his metal arm around Jeremiah's shoulders, hugging him lovingly, both of them watching as Jet and Gemini raise the piercers above James and Will's eyes. And James says, "Please, I'll do anything you want. Just make them stop." And Xelion thinks for a few seconds before raising his metal hand as he says, "Stop. Jet, Jim, what are you doing wrong?" Jet and Gemini both freeze in place, watching their father in silence as Xelion walks over to them and takes the piercers, dunking the tips in hot water in the sink near the medical tables and cleaning them as he says, "Always sterilize your tools." Then hands the piercers back to Jet and Gemini, making James and Will widen their own eyes in pure terror as they watch the demonic children thrust the bladed tips down toward their eyes one at a time. And then all was dark, darkness, and pain. Thank you all for listening. This has been chapters 5 and 6 of Eternal Care Forest, with me, XelionGraves. Tune in next time, where we will learn more of the unfortunate tale of James and Will. Sweet dreams.